Those of you that listen to Odd Lots know that obviously we talk a lot about financial markets on the show, and I think sometimes there's a tendency to think that markets are sort of divorced from people's day-to-day lives when in fact they matter a lot to how everyone lives. So for our next panel, we're going to focus on some big moments in the debt market specifically, and big moments in the debt market that have actually changed the world in various ways. Our next two panelists are Brad Setzer, an American economist and former staff economist at the Treasury Department. Many of you probably follow him on Twitter, and if you don't, you definitely should, because he has great insights. And we also have Lee Buccheit, who's been described previously as the philosopher king of sovereign debt lawyers. He's represented nearly every country that's gone bankrupt since the 1980s and really reshaped the way that we think about sovereign debt. His mere presence at airports have been known to move a country's debt market. And he's recently retired from the law firm Cleary Gottlieb, and we managed to get him out of his semi-retirement to come talk to us. So very exciting. Let's bring them on. Right. So we purposefully gave ourselves a really sort of vague intro, which means I now have to struggle to think what the first question is. But I think we want to focus on debt crises to begin with. Do they all look the same? Is there a common thread? How do you actually spot a debt crisis coming? Lee, let's start with you.
They don't all look the same, but they have one thing in common. They're all a crisis. And they never come in isolation. A sovereign debt crisis will almost always be accompanied by a banking crisis or trade crisis, a currency crisis, sometimes a social crisis. The pressure on the politicians who are there when the crisis begins is intense because they all know that history suggests that the politicians there when a crisis begins are rarely the ones there when it ends.
Brad, by the way, I just want to tell a little quick anecdote about Brad because we're here. So I think it was probably 14 years ago, and I was like unemployed. I hadn't been in New York that long. I applied for a job to like blog about economics or something, and Brad was my interviewer, and I bombed the interview, and I didn't get the job. That's because he asked me about Argentina had just defaulted a couple of years ago, and he asked me some question about Argentina. I was like, I just, BS'd my way through it. I had no idea. So I bombed. I didn't get it. But we're now here, and I'm, he's in the hot seat. So, and once again, Argentina is in the news. So, Brad, why does Argentina, first of all, second of all, why does Argentina, why do they default so much? What's the deal with that?
I made probably one of the biggest hiring mistakes in my life. We'd actually hired Felix Salmon, who turned out to be a pretty good blogger.
That was an even bigger mistake.
So we could have put together Felix and Joe and probably been a successful blogging firm. So why does Argentina default so much? I guess it's because people lend them so much money.
Okay, why do people keep lending them money? Because this seems to happen literally at this point almost every 5 years.
I think people consistently overestimate Argentina's capacity to repay.
Thank you for your insight.
This kind of gets like wonky sovereign debt-y.
That's why we're here.
Argentina doesn't have a big export base. It exports soybeans and soybean oil. It hasn't developed other export industries. So exports are a very small share of Argentina's economy. If you have a small share of exports, you have less capacity to support foreign currency debt. Yet Argentina keeps borrowing in foreign currency.
Well, sorry, Brad.
So, essentially every time what would normally be a currency move, a depreciation, it turns into a debt crisis.
So I described Lee's career saying that he's represented in numerous governments. So give us your opinion on why those governments keep tapping the market for money that apparently they can't actually afford.
Look, in the 21st century, no sovereign borrows money in the international markets with the expectation that they'll ever have to repay it. If by repay you mean devote current resources to settle that liability, they borrow it in the sure and certain hope that when it matures, they will be able to go back into the market and borrow from someone else to pay that back. And when that matures, they'll do the same, so on in perpetuity. I sometimes think of sovereign debt that it used to be a joke that if you had a pal who was on a diet and you saw them about to tuck into a chocolate eclair, you were supposed to say to them, now remember, a moment on the lips, a lifetime on the hips. Sovereign debt is that. When a sovereign borrows money today, that debt, in a net sense, will probably stay on its balance sheet forever. Which is why sovereign debt stocks almost always go up. They will occasionally go down, but almost always go up, relentlessly, remorselessly.
Well, Brad, you mentioned that Argentina is particularly ill-suited to take on foreign currency debt due to its immature export base. Why not adopt a different model? Why do they have to borrow from international markets?
Well, I mean, they have at times tried a different model. I mean, for better or for worse, the Kirchners were frozen out of the market for a long period of time. They still kind of wanted to run budget deficits, so they kind of borrowed from the central bank to finance government spending. Macri came along and said, I wanted to go back to be a more legitimate form of finance. And Argentina, in addition to having a small export sector, has a really small banking sector. You know, lots of historical reasons, the history of inflation. So we couldn't finance the budget deficit with the banking sector. The market was there, and the temptation was strong.
Lee, should they do a different approach? And I'm also curious, like, after Macri won, everyone's like, yay, he's going to do all the liberal reforms that people want, and the IMF is excited because they're going to do some playbook. And obviously, as we've seen over the last several months, it's completely failed. How much burden is there on responsibility on the international community, whether it's organizations like the IMF, to try that playbook again and sort of think like, how much is it their fault for adopting this pattern that just isn't working?
Well, there's a curious asymmetry in the international financial markets. Organizations like the IMF, every year, by their articles of agreement, will send a team of economists down to every one of their members, analyze the fiscal policies, and usually criticize them, sometimes brutally. But they have no power at that stage to get the country to change policy. It is only when the country cannot pay its debts and comes to the IMF and asks for a program that the IMF can begin to say, you must adopt these fiscal adjustment measures. It's a curious asymmetry. It's as though the medical profession was unable to tell patients to avoid smoking cigarettes, that they could only help them when they come in with the consequences of it.
So is the solution to debt crises, does it always have to be fiscal adjustment or austerity, or are there alternatives that are just never pursued?
Well, debt crises, you started this question, Tracy. Debt crises come in different forms. Sometimes, often, I guess, they are caused by chronic fiscal mismanagement of the economy, but not always. There have been debt crises caused by natural disasters, the hurricane, the earthquake, the tidal wave. Debt crises can be caused by a Lehman moment in the international markets. debt crisis can be caused by some other sovereign, some other place in the world misbehaving, or the victim of gross misfortune, which causes the investor community to recoil. And it's almost like you're seeing them wake up and remember the risks of sovereign lending, and then they pull back. And when they pull back, going back to my earlier analogy, when all the debt is assumed to be refinanceable and it no longer is refinanceable, then there's a debt crisis.
Brad, do you think some other model should be pursued? I mean, let's say you could go back in time to right after Macri wins the election or some other point. Was there another path that plausibly could have been taken by Argentina to avoid this? And I don't mean like, more austerity per se, because for whatever, it's tough. But was there like a totally different approach they could have taken?
In Argentina's particular case, there were choices, but I'm not sure the choices would have avoided some form of austerity. One choice would have been to borrow more in pesos, not to borrow in dollars. I mean, you get into debt trouble most typically when you borrow in a currency that is not your own. There may be some differences across cases, but that's the commonality. Otherwise, you can sort of print your way out of the crisis. So once Macri decided not to borrow in pesos, I think they were on a difficult trajectory. So you could have borrowed more in pesos. You could have retained some of the capital controls, tried to lock in the domestic investors and force them to keep buying Argentina's debt. And in that world, if you had not been relying as heavily on the central bank for financing, you probably would have had to have run smaller fiscal deficits at the time. The other question, which sort of Lee avoided, is that once you get into trouble and once you default, then it becomes a question of how much you want to pay back. And so one way of avoiding too much austerity after you have stopped paying is to strike a generous deal with your creditors and give yourself a fresh start.
Right. On this note, Lee, do you hate creditors?
No, certainly not. Look, the countries, all countries, but particularly developing economies, can benefit enormously from access to capital markets if it is done with moderation and maturity. The problem, and this goes to Joe's, you were dancing around this, but the answer to your question is that the political flesh is notoriously weak. Look, politicians like to spend money. It helps them get reelected. Politicians don't like to tax because it doesn't help them get reelected. They don't like to cut services because that doesn't help them. Borrowing, particularly borrowing from outside your own country, so in the international markets, is the way to cover that deficit. It allows you to spend money without raising taxes, and for as long as it lasts, it's a wonderful thing. But the problem is, it is, for most politicians, too tempting. And they will borrow often to the saturation point of what the market will lend them. And that is where global economics comes in. If you live in a time, as we have for 10 years, in which the central banks, the major central banks of the world, have driven interest rates to near zero and have pumped massive amounts of liquidity into the market through quantitative easing and similar programs, there's enormous amount of money sloshing around that will need a home, and they will welcome a borrower willing to take it. So there you have a confluence of two dangerous things: a tendency of politicians to borrow as much as they can, and a tendency of a market, not a tendency, a financial imperative to lend money to someone at the best interest rate they can.
Let's talk about a country that's even worse shaped by a long shot, I think, than Argentina, and that is Venezuela. And Tracy mentioned, Lee, that you were in retirement, but given all the ructions...
Semi-retirement.
Semi-retirement. So you are involved in some way in Venezuela, but you're not working for Maduro, right?
No.
Okay. So what are you doing with Venezuela?
Yeah, I am acting as what we're calling a strategic advisor to the Guaido administration in Venezuela.
And what's on the agenda for helping them, and how much can you actually do as long as Maduro is clinging onto power?
Well, that's the problem. Until that man takes the hint that he should exit the political stage, there isn't much that can be done with respect to the country's external debt. The country owes north of 150 billion US dollars. Its economy has been utterly decimated by 20 years of corruption and grotesque economic mismanagement. There is a deep humanitarian crisis in the country. There is a serious refugee crisis at levels proportional to Syria. But there is no possibility of dealing with that debt stock until Mr. Maduro says adios.
Brad, do you have any thoughts on
Any suggestions?
The approach forward for Venezuela?
Well, I mean, Venezuela is going to be like the Super Bowl for sovereign debt lawyers. Once the restructuring gets started, you have every single possible issue. You have two sovereign borrowers, one sovereign, one quasi-sovereign, the PDVSA, the state oil company, both of whom owe a decent amount in international bonds. The legal equivalence or non-equivalence between their debts is to be determined. Ample scope for creativity. The contractual provisions in Venezuela's bonds are very old school, which means that they have more litigation possibilities and avenues and fewer tools to facilitate a restructuring than a modern restructuring clause would allow. You have an issue of equity between bondholders and sovereign creditors like China, like Russia, but then Russia's played a kind of clever game because Russia hasn't lent necessarily as Russia. Russia has lent as Rosneft, the state oil company, which sort of seems like the sovereign, but it isn't technically the sovereign. You have a whole host of court claims for past expropriation, whose relative rank, I think, is not clear compared to other obligations. Lee may have a different view. And so I think it has every avenue of complexity that one could ever imagine, combined with the greatest need for debt reduction I think one can imagine.
Brad, how important are debt relationships to international politics? Because on the one hand, you are building up a relationship between two companies. This country owes that country some money or vice versa. But on the other hand, you can see it as a point of antagonism when things start to go wrong or whenever there's tensions. And the one I'm thinking about right now is China and the US and $1 trillion plus worth of US treasuries held by China.
Look, I probably made my name by tracking China's treasury holdings before anyone else thought it was interesting. And the boring reality is that the treasuries have been the most boring aspect of the trade war. China hasn't used them as leverage. China probably can't use them effectively as leverage. I think China has been disappointed by the fact that its treasury holdings, which at one point in time were like 25% of China's GDP, they've kind of come down. Treasury and agencies, to be correct, have never really provided them with much leverage over the U.S. political system. Soybean farmers, on the other hand, are a much more potent political force. I think that's partially because the U.S. borrows in its own currency, partially because the Fed can buy far more bonds than China could ever sell, and partially because the relationship with China was always arm's length. The U.S. never really wanted China to accumulate so many reserves. And as a result, the U.S. never promised China much of a return. I think the Chinese learned this. I think one of my theses is that frustration with the lack of leverage provided by Treasury bonds contributed to China's decision to lend more through its policy banks, more through the Belt and Road Initiative, more through direct, close relationships, loans to specific politicians, specific companies, and less through a deep liquid bond market like the Treasury market.
So I don't know if people know this or not, but Tracy has contributed to the tensions between the U.S. and China with an article that she wrote a couple of weeks ago. So apparently there's some people that like bought some old Chinese bonds from like the early 1900s, like in an antique shop or something like that they just say they're bonds. And now they're trying to lobby the Trump administration to get, to enforce, you describe it, they want Trump to make China pay them.
Sure. They want Trump to basically exert pressure on China to pay this 100-year-old debt that the People's Republic of China actually repudiated back in 1949.
So Lee, we were talking about this earlier. Do you think they have any sort of shot at these people like picked up some pieces of paper and
Wait. Is China going to be represented by Lee? In which case, no shot.
Legally, I think not. Whether Mr. Trump wishes to use this or rattle this saber, that I don't know. But these bonds were actually the subject of litigation back in the 1980s. And the courts decided that the statute of limitations had run on these obligations. It isn't just China, by the way. There are Tsarist Russian bonds that went into default in 1917. They slosh around. And there was actually a very interesting situation in the mid-90s when Russia wanted to issue Euro bonds in Europe. The French government said to the Russian government, not until you pay us some money to settle the old Tsarist bonds that are held by French citizens. And they paid them, I think, $500 million to do that. So these things slosh around. There are other countries, by the way, that
so there might be a little bit of option value. Something could happen where they're worth more than the paper, right?
My image is most of these things are framed and on bathroom walls and break the glass when Mr. Trump tells you to.
They are beautiful debt certificates. I'm just going to say that. They're very gorgeous, and we should all buy them for the art value, at least. Lee, we'd be remiss if we didn't ask you, in your 40-plus year career, what your most interesting moment was, jetting in and out of countries often in bankruptcy or on the verge.
Interesting is a hard adjective, but most tense, I think, was Greece. Greece in 2010 encountered a terrible debt crisis. Greece, a member of the Eurozone, a member of the European Union. So it had as its domestic currency the euro. But it wasn't a domestic currency like the Argentine pesos. The Greeks unilaterally couldn't print it. And so in that sense, it was a foreign currency. They owed north of 300 billion euros, virtually all of it in the form of bonds. And the question was, would a debt restructuring for that debt stock force Greece to leave the Eurozone, possibly force it to leave the European Union, to bring back the drachma? And that had enormous political consequences across Europe, because many in Europe thought that the Eurozone, the monetary union, was indissoluble. And had it proven not to be, might there have been others who would leave? Might the markets have looked at Greece and said, if Greece can restructure, maybe Spain could, maybe Italy could, maybe La Belle France could. And would that not bring a cataclysm upon European finance? So it was a tense period.
All right, we're almost wrapped up. Before we go, I just want to turn the subject a little bit because, Brad, we were talking about U.S.-China and the trade war, and sometimes you come on TV and I say, what's your prediction for the trade war? So with less than a minute to go at this point, what is your prediction for where things are going with U.S.-China trade?
My guess, this is one of the cases where you can get on TV simply by reading the president's Twitter account and saying that the best predictor of what U.S. trade policy will be with the tone of his past 10 tweets. If the past 10 tweets are Jay Powell is the biggest threat to human civilization, then he's probably not thinking about escalating with China. If his last 10 tweets are I'm a tariff man, he probably is going to escalate with China. So the recent pattern of tweets seem to be back on Jay Powell is not the world's best central banker, rather than China is our greatest enemy. So right now I'm putting slightly higher odds on a kind of what's called the mini deal. China buys some soybeans, the U.S. doesn't escalate any further. I don't think the Trump administration really wants to do the last round of tariffs anyway. And then that provides sort of an unspoken truce to go through the election.
All right.
All right, we're going to leave it there. That's Lee Buccheit and Brad Setzer. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you
being
both.
with us.